Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio. Welcome to Policy and Rights, the show about government policy and human rights.
Excellent. Bien, merci tout le monde pour nous joindre aujourd'hui. Alors, nous sommes à les Nations Unies et nous allons offrir des commentaires en commençant par le ministre, en suivant par notre ambassadeur du changement climatique, Catherine Stewart. Hello everybody. Welcome to our media scrum today on the second day of UNGA at United Nations. And today we'll have remarks offered by Minister of Climate Change and Environment Climate Change Canada, Steven Guilbeault, followed by our Ambassador for Climate Change, Catherine Stewart. So please, Mr. Guilbeault.
Bonjour, est-ce que je dois prendre le micro? Bonjour, très heureux d'être ici à New York, au siège social des Nations Unies pour cette importante rencontre, ce sommet sur l'ambition climatique. Très honoré que le Canada fasse partie des quelques 30 pays qui ont été invités à prendre la parole. Le premier ministre a parlé un peu plus tôt aujourd'hui. Je pense que cette invitation-là du secrétaire général des Nations Unies montre à quel point les choses ont changé au Canada. Je pense que si poser la question, c'est répondre. Est-ce que le Canada aurait été invité à participer à ce genre de sommet-là il y a 10 ans? La réponse est non. Est-ce que le Canada serait invité à participer à ce genre de sommet-là si Pierre Poilievre devient un jour premier ministre du Canada? La réponse est également non. Nous avons été invités à parler ici, à prendre la parole à cause de tout ce que nous avons fait, tout ce que nous faisons, que ce soit la tarification carbone, que ce soit la lutte aux émissions de méthane, qui est un gaz à effet de serre très puissant. Et si collectivement on s'attaque au méthane, nous pouvons réduire la température globale de presque 1 degré Celsius. C'est majeur. C'est d'ailleurs pourquoi le premier ministre a annoncé ce matin que nous aurons un nouveau cadre réglementaire pour réduire les émissions de méthane de plus de 75 % d'ici 2030, ce qui en fait l'un des objectifs les plus ambitieux sur la Terre. On pourrait parler du fait que nous sommes le seul pays du G20 qui avons éliminé les subventions aux combustibles fossiles. Aucun autre pays du G20 ne l'a fait. Et nous avons également pris l'engagement d'éliminer les subventions publiques, le financement public aux combustibles fossiles, ce qu'aucun autre pays du G20 a fait également. Alors, je pense que l'ensemble de ces éléments-là démontre à quel point ce que fait le Canada est maintenant reconnu sur la scène internationale. Je vais passer la parole à notre ambassadrice sur les changements climatiques, Mme Catherine Stewart, et je vais faire le bout en anglais par la suite.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le ministre. Je suis très ravie d'être ici parmi vous. Le Canada est vraiment un leader au niveau international et je suis très fière de représenter le Canada au niveau international, d'engager mes collègues internationaux parce que nous faisons beaucoup au niveau de l'atténuation, de l'adaptation et nous donnons aussi beaucoup de support pour les pays en voie de développement avec nos financements climatiques. Donc, merci beaucoup pour être ici.
Thank you, Catherine. So, very happy to be here at the UN headquarters in New York for the Secretary General's Climate Action Summit. Canada, it's an honor to have been invited to be part of the 30-some countries that can speak at the summit. The Prime Minister spoke a little bit earlier this morning, and I think that the reasons why Canada have been invited are numerous. We're the only G20 country that has made good on the commitment to phase out fossil fuel subsidies. No other G20 country has done that. We're the only G20 country that has announced that we would go even beyond the G20 commitment for phasing out fossil fuel subsidies by phasing out public financing of fossil fuel, which we said we would put in place in 2024. We have a very ambitious agenda in Canada in terms of fighting climate change, obviously carbon pricing, zero-emission vehicle. We will enable the regulations for that by COP28, but also what we're doing on methane. This morning, the Prime Minister announced that we will be presenting soon the framework so that Canada can achieve or even surpass our goal of reducing methane emission by at least 75% by 2030. It's one of the most ambitious goals in the planet. And why is methane so important? It's a very powerful greenhouse gas, but if collectively we can work to reduce methane emission, we can shave off almost 1 degree Celsius of temperature increase in the coming decades. This is massive, which is why we're doing this work alongside many of our allies, certainly California, the United States, and many others as well. I think if we were to ask the question, would Canada have been invited here 10 years ago under a Stephen Harper government? The answer is obviously no. Would Canada be invited here if Pierre Poilievre ever becomes Prime Minister of Canada? The answer is also no, because Stephen Harper didn't have any plans on climate change, and Pierre Poilievre doesn't even believe, the Conservative Party of Canada doesn't believe that climate change is an issue that's worth paying any attention to. So we're very proud and very honored to have been invited here today, and happy to take your questions. Oh, sorry, no, I'll pass it over to Catherine Stewart, our ambassador to climate change.
Thank you very much, Minister. And as Canada's ambassador for climate change, I engage regularly internationally with all colleagues from around the world. And I have to say, I'm very proud to represent Canada on the international stage because we have a very strong record on mitigation, on adaptation, and also in the support that we give to developing countries.
Monsieur Guilbeault, qu'est-ce que vous pensez d'une initiative comme la Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, qui est un regroupement de pays,
que je connais bien,
d'États en fait, qui, vous connaissez un peu Hier, Al Gore a dit que les membres de cette association-là étaient les véritables héros des changements climatiques. Qu'est-ce que vous pensez de ça?
Je pense qu'on a besoin de toutes sortes d'initiatives pour lutter contre les changements climatiques. Ces initiatives, il y en a quelques-unes qui s'attaquent à la question de la production de combustibles fossiles, sont importantes, mais il faut bien comprendre qu'on peut s'engager à ne pas produire des combustibles fossiles, mais si on en consomme, si on continue d'en consommer autant qu'on en consommait avant, on déplace le problème. Si on ne réduit pas notre consommation de pétrole, collectivement, ça ne nous avance pas en matière de lutte au changement climatique. Le Québec s'est engagé à faire partie de cette organisation-là. On continue d'importer du pétrole au Québec, 360 000 barils de pétrole par jour. Alors, on ne le produit pas, mais il y a quelqu'un d'autre qui le produit pour nous, les Québécois et les Québécoises, qui l'utilisons. Donc, on a besoin de ce genre d'initiative-là, mais il faut regarder l'ensemble de l'équation. On parle de production, mais il faut aussi s'attaquer à la consommation de combustibles fossiles. C'est pourquoi au Canada, on travaille sur l'électrification des transports, les transports en commun, l'électrification des procédés industriels, par exemple, pour réduire notre dépendance aux combustibles fossiles.
Mais donc,
la caméra. Sorry.
Mais en fait, le Canada est un pays producteur de pétrole. Là.
Oui.
Ce serait impensable de joindre une association comme celle-là, compte tenu de l'importance d'une industrie pétrolière.
D'abord, vous savez comme moi que l'utilisation des ressources naturelles est de compétence provinciale au Canada. Ce n'est pas le gouvernement fédéral qui décide de l'utilisation des ressources naturelles. Et lorsqu'on regarde les scénarios, par exemple, de l'Agence internationale de l'énergie ou même du GIEC, on estime que dans un monde carboneutre en 2050, il va rester à peu près 25 millions de barils de pétrole par jour qui va être utilisé. Beaucoup moins qu'aujourd'hui, on est à un peu plus de 100 millions par jour. Donc, c'est 75 % de réduction de l'utilisation de pétrole au cours des prochaines décennies, mais il va en rester. Notre objectif, ce qu'on doit faire collectivement, c'est de nous assurer que le pétrole qui sera encore consommé en 2050 soit un pétrole à très faible émission en termes de l'extraction et que les émissions de gaz à effet de serre qui resteront devront être compensées ou séquestrées.
Parlons d'émissions, justement. Vous en êtes où dans vos négociations pour l'établissement d'un système de plafonnement des émissions du secteur pétrolier?
Je vous rassure, ce n'est pas une négociation. On a des discussions. On a des discussions avec les provinces, les territoires, les entreprises concernées, les experts, les ONG, les Premières Nations, bien évidemment. Mais nous avons pris l'engagement. Le premier ministre, c'était dans la plateforme électorale de 2021. Le premier ministre l'a réitéré lors de la conférence de Glasgow en 2021 en Écosse. Et ce qu'il a annoncé ce matin, c'est que nous aurons le projet de règlement pour le plafond sur les émissions de gaz à effet de serre du secteur du pétrole et du gaz d'ici la fin de l'année.
The chair of this morning's summit, though, called Canada one of the largest expanders of fossil fuels this year. And so the Prime Minister didn't address that in his address this morning. So will your government address this? Will it address oil and gas expansion?
We've been very clear on regarding the issue of oil and gas in Canada. As I told your colleague in French, the federal government has no jurisdiction over the use of natural resources. From a constitutional point of view, that's very clear. What we've said and what we are doing is tackling pollution from the oil and gas sector and from all the other economic sectors in Canada, which is why between 2019 and 2021, Canada has the best performance of all G7 countries when it comes to tackling climate change and climate emissions. So we're doing it, and our plan is starting to work. I'll be the first one to say we have to do more, which is why we're coming up with new measures. I recently introduced the clean electricity regulations to ensure that our electricity grid is carbon neutral by 2035. We're the first G20 countries to have eliminated fossil fuel subsidies as per our G20 commitment. And we're also the only large oil and gas producer who has committed to put in place a cap on the emissions of the oil and gas sector.
What assurances can you give to environmentalists? And they say that they're worried about this cap on emissions, that it won't go far enough, that there could be exceptions. So what assurances can you give to people who are worried about that these will be a strong cap on emissions?
I would remind my ex-colleagues from the environmental movement that they saluted our emission reduction plan that was presented last year by the Prime Minister and myself, which showed how, for the first time in the history of Canada, which mapped how we get to our 2030 targets, and that showed that all sectors have to do their fair share. And that's what we're asking from the oil and gas sector, as we're asking from other industrial sectors in Canada.
Minister, is the message here that it is possible, and Canada is an example of a country that can have it both ways, it can be an oil and gas producer and also reduce emissions to the point where it's ultimately getting to a net zero target? I mean, is that the example that we're trying to set?
If you look at the analysis, for example, of the International Energy Agency, and the IPCC, for example, we understand that we are moving into a carbon-constrained world, and that collectively we will reduce our dependencies on fossil fuels. There will be less and less fossil fuels used as we electrify our transportation system, as we electrify our industrial system, as we electrify our grid. We will need less fossil fuels than we need now, and Canada, as a responsible country, we need to ensure that this transition, this energy transition, is done in a way that is just and that is fair for workers, which is why my colleagues have introduced in spring in Parliament a sustainable jobs bill to ensure that as we slowly and probably more rapidly as years go by, reduce our dependencies on fossil fuels, that communities that are concerned and workers that are impacted by that are being treated fairly.
Donc on peut faire les deux, c'est ça que vous envoyez comme message?
Ce que je dis, c'est que il y a un consensus assez général. Je pense que certaines compagnies pétrolières le remettent en cause, mais ils sont à peu près les seuls, que nous allons de consommer de moins en moins de pétrole et de gaz au cours des décennies à venir. Nous allons passer de quelque chose à 100 millions de barils de pétrole par jour consommés aujourd'hui à autour de 25 millions en 2050 dans un monde carboneutre. Alors, il va rester du pétrole dans notre portefeuille énergétique, mais ce ne sera pas l'énergie dominante que c'est aujourd'hui. Et il faut préparer cette transition-là. Et ce que je dis, c'est que c'est exactement ce à quoi nous travaillons au Canada par l'ensemble de nos mesures, que ce soit des mesures de type incitatif, les investissements qui ont été faits dans le dernier budget fédéral, par exemple, mais aussi les mesures réglementaires. On pense évidemment le plafond sur les émissions de gaz à effet de serre du secteur du pétrole et du gaz, la lutte aux émissions de méthane, la norme zéro émission pour les véhicules, la norme sur les carburants propres. Donc, au Canada, on utilise l'ensemble des outils disponibles pour s'attaquer au problème de la pollution climatique. Factually speaking, the climate change problem is the fact that still today about 70% of our global energy portfolio is fossil fuel based. There's no big revelation in that. It's a fact, and I think we all recognize that fact, and we also recognize that we need to reduce our dependencies on fossil fuel, and that's exactly what Canada's doing. We're phasing out coal. We have legislated that we should be out of coal by 2030. Frankly, I think we will get there before. We're regulating that we should reduce, if not almost eliminate, the place of fossil fuels in our grid by 2035. We're doing all these things.
But is this the best you can do, just given the politics of this country? Is this the best you can do?
Our 2030 targets are aligned with the Paris commitment to keep global average temperatures to 2 degrees Celsius and as close as possible to 1.5 degrees Celsius. The IPCC says that by 2030, countries need to reduce their emissions by 43%. Our target is to reduce them by 40 to 45%. The IPCC says we need to be carbon neutral by 2050. We have legislated that Canada will be carbon neutral by 2050. And as Environment Minister, I have to report back to Parliament on the progress we're doing every 2 years on what we're doing. So I think Canada is doing exactly what science is asking us to do.
On the oil and gas draft regulations, I think you said previously that they would be coming in place by October. Is that still the timeline?
Remember, what we will be introducing are draft regulations as per our processes. Then there will be a consultation period afterward for the preparation of the final regulations. This usually takes about 12 to 14 months between the introduction of the draft regulations and the final regulations in Canada.
But that's still October, right? That's the timeline?
The Prime Minister said this year, and we're working very hard to ensure that, if the Prime Minister said it's going to be this year, you can make sure that it's my job to be sure that it's stable this year. Honnêtement, qu'il se tienne au Canada ou ailleurs dans le monde, je vous inviterais à aller lire le discours qu'a livré mon collègue et ami, le ministre Wilkinson, qui a rappelé aux représentants du Congrès mondial du pétrole réunis en Alberta que nous sommes dans un monde qui consomme présentement autour de 100 millions de barils de pétrole par jour. Et dans le cadre il a dit on a deux choix. Dans le cadre de la lutte au changement climatique, si on est sérieux et que l'on veut prévenir des augmentations de température qui dépassent 1,5 degré Celsius, on va passer d'un monde où on consomme 100 millions de barils de pétrole par jour à un monde qui va en consommer 25 millions de barils de pétrole par jour. C'est ce que mon collègue est allé dire aux représentants et il leur a dit que on peut pas d'une part dire qu'on va lutter contre les changements climatiques et d'autre part ne pas être prêt à poser les gestes nécessaires, comme nous le faisons au Canada, que ce soit pour l'industrie de l'automobile, que ce soit pour les cimenteries, le secteur de l'acier, l'aluminium ou encore celui du pétrole et du gaz. Nous devons prendre des mesures pour lutter contre les changements climatiques et c'est le message qui est allé porter le ministre Wilkinson lors du congrès en Alberta.
Qu'est-ce que vous pensez du fait que le Québec a été invité à participer ici au sommet sur la mission climatique?
Je pense que c'est une belle reconnaissance pour le travail que le Québec fait depuis de très nombreuses années. J'ai moi-même, dans une ancienne vie, participé à élaborer des pans de ce travail-là. Le premier plan de lutte au changement climatique, la loi zéro émission. Le Québec est le premier État hors des États-Unis à se doter d'une loi zéro émission pour les véhicules électriques. La Colombie-Britannique a suivi et là, nous le faisons maintenant au fédéral. Donc, je pense que c'est une belle reconnaissance pour le Québec.
Diriez-vous que le Québec est par rapport, par exemple, aux autres provinces et à l'État fédéral, que le Québec est un chef de file?
Écoutez, je ne suis pas ici là, pour juger des uns et des autres. Ce que je peux dire, c'est que ce que la science nous demande, c'est que nous devons toutes et tous en faire plus. Alors qu'on soit bon, qu'on soit pas bon, c'est sûr que si on n'est pas bon, il faut en faire peut-être encore plus que ceux qui sont bons, mais on peut pas. Il n'y a personne sur la planète qui peut dire moi j'ai tout bon en matière de lutte au changement climatique, je peux arrêter ce que je fais. Nous devons toutes et tous en faire plus. Ça inclut le Canada, certainement, et ça inclut l'ensemble des membres de la Fédération canadienne.
Last question, dernière question.
Ça peut pas, quand vous discutez avec les gens ici, dites quoi à ceux qui pourront remarquer que vous tenez ce discours-là pendant que mon collègue le soulignait, les grandes industries pétrolières se réunissent dans votre cour arrière. On voit un drôle de message, il n'y a pas un paradoxe là.
Sincèrement, depuis que je suis ici, depuis 2 jours, ce dont les gens me parlent, que ce soit d'Afrique, que ce soit d'Asie, que ce soit les pays insulaires, que ce soit nos collègues européens, ces gens-là saluent le travail que fait le Canada sur la scène internationale, que ce soit en matière de lutte au changement climatique, que ce soit sur la question de la nature et de la biodiversité. Le rôle que le Canada a joué à la COP15 est salué d'un bout à l'autre du monde. Que ce soit sur les plastiques, par exemple, la pollution plastique, nous allons recevoir l'an prochain, au printemps prochain, les Nations unies à Ottawa dans le cadre des négociations sur un nouveau traité pour lutter contre la pollution plastique. Le Canada fait partie de la coalition pour la haute ambition, pour la lutte à la pollution plastique. Alors moi, ce que j'entends, c'est des gens qui voient que le Canada, comme l'ensemble des pays, a des défis en matière de lutte au changement climatique. Il n'y a personne qui peut se pointer ici et dire « moi, j'ai tout réglé ça », mais je pense qu'on reconnaît au niveau international, et notre ambassadrice en parlait tout à l'heure, tout le travail qui est fait par le Canada pour s'attaquer à ces trois grandes crises planétaires-là. Merci beaucoup. Thank you so much.
Fumio, Prime Minister of Japan. I invite him to address the Assembly.
Mr. President, Excellencies, now we have gathered in New York once again. The SDGs are at their midpoint, facing mounting obstacles. And to our dismay, the aggression against Ukraine has yet to cease. This year, as the world stands at a historical inflection point, Japan serves as a non-permanent member of the Security Council and the presidency of the G7. In those capacities, I have heard the desperate desire for peace and the pleas of vulnerable people seeking help. We should respond to these voices and work towards a world filled with cooperation and not division and confrontation. This is my message to all the leaders of the member states. In our common agenda, Secretary General Guterres called for international solidarity. Let us renew our commitment to a strong and effective multilateralism with the United Nations at its core. Mr. President, the world faces complex and interrelated issues ranging from climate change, infectious diseases, to challenges to the rule of law. Now, at a time when international cooperation is in want more than ever, we cannot overcome these difficulties if the international community remains divided over ideologies or values. That is why I believe we should go back to the very basic foundation of treating human life and dignity with paramount importance. We should aim for a world caring for human dignity where vulnerable people can live safely and security. At a time when the international community is facing multiple crises and increasingly being divided, we need a common language which resonates with all of us. By shedding new light on human dignity, I believe the international community can overcome differences in regimes or values and steadily advance human-centered international cooperation. Japan has led human-centered international cooperation based on the concept of human security. With this approach, we need to accelerate the efforts among the international community to achieve the SDGs. The dignity of the individual must not be neglected as states and the international community tackle global challenges. to overcome inequalities and achieve the SDGs, quality growth and sustainable growth are essential. The key is to invest in people, which is my political credo. Gender perspective is also important for quality growth. Japan aims to reduce inequalities and overcome social divisions by promoting women's participation. Japan will promote transparent and fair development finance in accordance with international rules to achieve sustainable growth in developing countries. Private finance will also be tapped to fill the gap of development finance. Japan will work with other countries to find ways to manage economies that protect human dignity while attracting investment dynamism. Mr. President, in order to address unprecedented crises and challenges and to protect and strengthen human dignity, let us start step by step from where we can. The first is cooperation towards the realization of a peaceful and stable international community where human dignity is respected. Hailing from Hiroshima, which was devastated by atomic bombing, I have made nuclear disarmament my lifelong mission. Towards achieving a world without nuclear weapons, we will continue to bolster realistic and practical efforts while upholding and strengthening the NPT by implementing measures under the Hiroshima Action Plan. I call on political leaders of nuclear weapon states and other countries around the globe to step up their engagement on nuclear disarmament so that those from all walks of life are exposed to its importance and take concrete action, not despite of, but because of the challenging security environment. With a view to working towards a world without nuclear weapons, which we have been striving for, together with the hibakshas, victims of atomic bombings, we must crystallize the nuclear disarmament trend, which has been successfully mainstreamed thanks to the efforts of our predecessors. As we speak, we are faced with the threat of the reversal of the downward trend of the global number of nuclear weapons. The significance of a treaty banning the production of fissile material for nuclear weapons or other explosive devices, FMCT, which was avowed here in the General Assembly 30 years ago, has not diminished by any measure. That is why I just co-hosted a high-level event on FMCT with the Philippines and Australia to refocus political attention towards the FMCT on the 30th year of its initial proposal. Having nuclear weapon states engage in concrete nuclear disarmament measures is key. Japan, as a non-permanent member of the Security Council, will work with the UN and relevant states to promote dialogue between nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states. To set in stone the trend of mainstreaming nuclear disarmament, it is paramount to transcend purely government efforts and engage in multi-layered efforts to overcome the divisive debate among academia and government over whether we should be choosing deterrence or disarmament. Japan will contribute 3 billion yen to newly established Japan Chair for a World Without Nuclear Weapons at overseas research institutes and think tanks. By using the Youth Leader Fund for a World Without Nuclear Weapons, which I established last year in cooperation with the United Nations, we will continue to build a global network of young people for nuclear abolition.
It is also essential to ensure nuclear safety and the security of nuclear materials and facilities, including in situations of conflict. We also need to defend the dignity of people jeopardized by armed conflicts. Russia's aggression against Ukraine continues. A food crisis must not be perpetuated. Supporting vulnerable people in Africa, the Middle East, and elsewhere is essential. We need to protect the safety of women and children, who are the most vulnerable in conflict situations, to strengthen border controls and measures against trafficking in person, as well as to provide international support to retrieve abducted children. Women, Peace and Security. WPS places women as crucial and active players in relevant policies for peace and security, and Japan will continue to promote this agenda.
The second is how to take a balance between the progress of digitalization and human dignity. Digitalization is bringing benefits to everybody. However, there are risks of privacy and human rights violations. We need a digital ecosystem and international rules that are compatible with human dignity. That is why at the G7 Hiroshima Summit, we launched the Hiroshima AI process on generative AI towards trustworthy AI. Japan will also strengthen our support for digitalization in developing countries while ensuring cybersecurity.
Third, Japan will work to mitigate the potential impact on people which may arise before net zero is achieved. Asian countries are the key to globally achieving net zero. Under the Asia Zero Emission Community Initiative, Japan will promote effective cooperation taking into account various needs. Japan will further support disaster risk reduction for countries vulnerable to climate change, including island states, aiding efforts towards resilient economies and societies against sea level rise and natural disasters associated with extreme weather events. The ocean is a new frontier with abundant potential, and it is essential to take comprehensive measures, including making use of blue carbon to tackle climate change. The perspective of international law is also important. Japan supports the preservation of existing baselines under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, even after the future regression of the coastline due to the sea level rise. As the G7 presidency, we have set a framework for cooperation on biodiversity conservation and a target of reducing additional plastic pollution to zero by 2040. Japan will continue to contribute in the field of environmental protection. Fourth, we must prepare for the next infectious disease outbreak. We must be ready for the next infectious disease learning from the lessons through the fight against COVID-19. As the G7, both the public and private sectors have pledged more than $48 billion to achieve universal health coverage and to strengthen prevention, preparedness, and response to health crisis. Japan will contribute $7.5 billion for the period of 2022 through 2025. Together with the mobilization of domestic financial resources, Japan supports mobilizing financial resources in the private sector through the promotion of impact investment. Japan will continue to work with developing countries, including emerging economies, to ensure equitable access to medical countermeasures for health emergencies, MCMs, based on the G20 outcomes. Mr. President, at a time when the world is at a historical inflection point, we must reflect on how we started here. Inscribed in the Charter of the United Nations is the firm determination of our predecessors after the experience of 2 world wars to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war and to protect human dignity. The principles of the UN Charter, such as sovereign equality, respect for territorial integrity, and the prohibition of the use of force, are fundamental principles of international law for people to live in peace and provide the basis of the rule of law. International law is there for the benefit of weaker states. Together, under the rule of law, Japan would like to protect the right of vulnerable nations and people to live in peace in order to safeguard and strengthen human dignity. However, even to this day, Russia, a permanent member of the Security Council, is infringing upon international law and the rule of law. Unilateral changes to the status quo by force or coercion are unacceptable anywhere in the world. The situation which the General Assembly has repeatedly condemned as a violation of the UN Charter and human rights must be rectified as soon as possible, and the nuclear threat must be ended. In March of this year, I announced a new plan for FOIP, a free and open Indo-Pacific, based on the principles of freedom, the rule of law, inclusiveness, openness, and diversity. Japan will work with countries that share a vision of a world where diverse nations coexist and prosper together. Japan will further extend our support for peacekeepers. Japan will strengthen the scope and quality of the UN Triangular Partnership Program with an additional contribution of around $9 billion to support of around $9 million to support the capacity building of personnel deployed in AUP support operations. Japan's policy on North Korea remains unchanged. Japan seeks to normalize the relationship with North Korea in accordance with the Japan DPRK Pyongyang Declaration through comprehensively resolving the outstanding issues of concern such as abductions, nuclear and missile issues, as well as the settlement of our unfortunate past. From the perspective of opening up a new era together, I would like to convey my determination to meet with President Kim Jong-un face-to-face at any time without any conditions, and would like to hold high-level talks under my direct supervision to realize a summit meeting at an early time. Mr. President, the United Nations should be a place of listening to the voices of people facing difficulties, empowering them, and overcoming such difficulties through cooperation. It should not be a place of confrontation, division. This year we have agreed on concrete measures to strengthen the structures that support the President of the General Assembly. This is a steady step towards a United Nations for a cooperation. We commend the Secretary General's leadership with his vision for multilateralism. Initiatives to limit the use of veto, which exacerbates division and confrontation in the United Nations, will strengthen and restore confidence in the Security Council. Japan will also continue its efforts to increase the transparency of discussions in the Security Council, including by improving access to deliberations in the Security Council for member states other than the permanent members. To this end, Japan will contribute to the clarification of the rules of the Security Council. The world is changing dramatically. We need a Security Council that reflects the world today. Japan supports increased representation of Africa and the need to expand both the permanent and the non-permanent membership of the Council. Looking ahead to next year's Summit of the Future and the subsequent 80th anniversary of the United Nations, now is the opportunity to move to concrete action. Mr. President, international cooperation that protects and strengthens human dignity will be the driving force that brings the world back towards the same goal. I am looking forward to deepening this discussion at next year's Summit of the Future with future generations in mind. And as we envision the post-2030 agenda in the future, I believe human dignity should be placed as the core principle that illuminates the future of the international community. Let us join our forces to strengthen human dignity and create a United Nations for cooperation. Thank you for your attention.
On behalf of the Assembly, I wish to thank the Prime Minister of Japan for the statement just made, and I request the protocol to escort His Excellency.
This show has been produced by Depictions Media. Please contact us at depictions.media for more information.